My daughter-in-law and my son lived in my house for 10 years. When my grandson was born, my daughter-in-law screamed, "Don't touch him, you're disgusting." I felt my blood run cold. I called my son and told him 3 words that left him breathless. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment what city you are watching me from. That way I can see how far my story has reached." 64 years of life. And I never thought the cruelest words I would ever hear would come from the mouth of my own daughter-in-law during the moment that should have been the happiest of my life. "Don't touch him, you're filthy." Dana's scream echoed through the hospital room like the crack of a whip. I stood there, Teresa Mitchell, holding the little gift I had bought for my newborn grandson, my hands shaking, not from excitement, but from absolute shock. The blue teddy bear slipped from my fingers and hit the floor as I took a step back, as if my daughter-in-law's words had been a physical slap across the face. George, my 35-year-old son, sat in the chair next to the hospital bed, staring at the ground. He didn't say a thing, not a single word in my defense. The silence of my own boy hurt worse than Dana's screaming. "Dana, please," I whispered, just trying to keep the peace. "I just want to meet my grandson." "Your grandson." Dana sat up in the bed, clutching the baby to her chest like I was a genuine threat. "This child is not going to be contaminated by your dirty hands. Not after everything we've had to endure living with you." The words dropped like stones in my stomach. Living with me, in my own house. The house I had bought with the sweat of 40 years working as a nurse. The house where I had taken them in when George lost his job 10 years ago. "Mom." George finally spoke, but his voice sounded tired, defeated. "Maybe it would be best if you left. Dana is really stressed from the delivery." I just stood there, feeling like the floor had opened up beneath my feet. The nurse who was adjusting Dana's pillows looked at me with a mix of pity and deep discomfort. I could see in her eyes that she had witnessed plenty of tough family drama, but this one had caught her completely off guard. "I understand," I said in a voice I didn't even recognize as my own. I picked the little bear up off the floor and set it on the nightstand. "I'll leave this here for when you're ready." I walked out of that room with my back straight, but inside I was crumbling to pieces. Every step toward the elevator felt like wading through thick molasses. My legs weighed a ton. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought everyone in the hallway could hear it. When those elevator doors finally slid shut, I let the tears fall. 10 years. 10 years I had lived in my own home feeling like a complete stranger. 10 years of walking on eggshells around Dana, just trying to keep the family peace. 10 years of watching my son drift away from me piece by piece until he became a stranger who couldn't even stand up for his own mother. But there was something neither George nor Dana knew. Something I had kept completely buried all these years, just waiting for the right moment. A secret that would change absolutely everything. As I drove back home, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned bone white. I remembered the day George showed up with his suitcases, asking if they could stay for just a few weeks until he found another job. Dana was pregnant back then, but they lost that baby at 2 months. I opened my home and my heart, thinking it was what any mother would do. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And I, like an absolute fool, let it happen because I thought I was helping my family. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a few minutes, staring at the house that had been my sanctuary for so long. A modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood with the garden George used to help me tend when he was a little boy. Now, that same garden was kept up by a landscaping company because Dana had decided I was too old to be kneeling in the dirt. I walked through the front door knowing I'd have the place to myself for the first time in years. George would be staying at the hospital with Dana tonight. I could finally take a breath without feeling like I was in someone's way. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the exact same table where I had helped George with his homework when he was a kid, where we had eaten breakfast together every single morning before he left for school. Now that table was cluttered with baby products Dana had bought, staking her claim on every inch like it belonged to her. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed the number I knew by heart. It rang 3 times before George picked up. "Mom, are you okay?" His voice sounded surprised. He hadn't called me Mom with that kind of warmth in years. "George," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. I need you to know something. Mom, if this is about what happened at the hospital, Dana didn't mean— Listen to me, son. I cut him off. My voice carried an edge I hadn't used with him in a decade. There is something I never told you. Something about the house. Something about all the keys. There was dead silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the dull hum of the hospital in the background, but George didn't say a word. You are coming to the house tomorrow, I continued. Just you. There are things you need to know before it is entirely too late. What are you talking about, Mom? I closed my eyes, feeling the crushing weight of all those years of silence. The keys to this house, George. You have never held the real keys. After I hung up, I sat there in my kitchen, wrapped in the quiet I had craved for 10 long years. For the first time in forever, I could actually hear the ticking of the wall clock my mother had given me. The very same clock Dana had threatened to throw in the trash because it made too much noise in the mornings. The memories started flooding in like a broken dam. I couldn't believe how blind I had been, how much I had allowed. It all started so subtly that I didn't even notice I was losing the grip on my own life. The first shift happened their second week in the house. I had come home from my shift at the hospital, dead on my feet like always, after 12 hours of taking care of patients. I walked into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee, and every single one of my plates was in a different place. I did a little reorganizing, Dana told me, flashing a smile I actually thought was sweet at the time. I hope you don't mind. It's just that some things were in really impractical spots. Impractical. The plates I had kept in the exact same cabinet for 20 years were suddenly impractical. But I didn't say a word. She was pregnant and stressed out, I told myself. She needed to feel comfortable. A week later, I came home to find she had rearranged all the furniture in the living room. The armchair where I used to read in the afternoons was shoved against a window with terrible light. My grandmother's coffee table was pushed off into a corner. It looks so much more spacious this way, don't you think? Dana said, rubbing her barely there belly. George says it has better feng shui. George didn't even know what feng shui meant, but he nodded when she looked at him, waiting for backup. Once again, I swallowed my pride. It was temporary. I reminded myself it was just until George found a job. But the weeks bled into months, and the changes got bolder. Dana started inviting her friends over without telling me. I'd walk in from work and find them in my living room, drinking my coffee out of my good mugs. The fine china I saved for special occasions. I hope you don't mind, she would say, always with that same calculated smile. I figured you wouldn't be home. She never actually asked when I'd be home. She just assumed she could do whatever she wanted. And I, playing the fool, kept making excuses for her because she was going through a rough patch after losing the baby. The real breaking point came 6 months after they moved in. I had worked a double shift, a brutal one. An elderly patient of mine with dementia had been particularly restless all night. I got home at 8 in the morning with swollen feet and an aching back, wanting nothing more than a hot shower and my bed. But when I opened the door to my own bedroom, I found Dana in there, emptying out my dresser. "What are you doing?" I asked, way too exhausted to hide how annoyed I was. "Oh, Teresa," she said, not even bothering to look at me. "I hope you don't mind. I needed a bigger space for my maternity clothes, and your room has the larger bathroom." My room? My bathroom? The ones I had paid for with my own bare hands through years of night shifts. "Dana, this is my bedroom," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. She finally turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't shame. It was pure irritation. Like I was the one being completely unreasonable. "Well, technically it's the master bedroom," she said with a tight, forced laugh. "And George and I are a married couple. It just makes more sense for us to have the master, don't you think?" George appeared in the doorway right then, like he had been waiting in the wings for the confrontation. But instead of backing me up, he looked at me with those tired eyes that had become so familiar. "Mom, it's just temporary," he said, "just until we get our own place." Temporary. That damn word I had been hearing for months. I packed my things and moved into the guest room, the smallest one in the house. The one facing the back alley where the garbage trucks rattled the windows every single morning at dawn. But the worst part wasn't the physical changes. The worst part was how Dana began changing the way George looked at me. Tiny little comments that seemed innocent at first, but over time grew sharper, more frequent, more vicious. "Your mom looks really exhausted lately," she'd tell George when she thought I was out of earshot. "Maybe she's working too hard for someone her age. Have you noticed your mom is forgetting things?" she whispered another time when I couldn't remember where I tossed my keys. Yesterday, she couldn't remember if she took her medication. I didn't even take any medication. But George started asking if I felt all right, if I needed help with basic chores. The seed of doubt was planted so slowly that even he didn't realize it was taking root. Dinner time became a war zone. Dana decided we all needed to eat healthier and seized total control of the kitchen. But her idea of healthy meant bland, tasteless food that left me starving. When I tried to cook one of my specialties, she wrinkled her nose. "Oh, Teresa, that's way too greasy for George. He's really trying to watch his health." George had eaten my cooking for 30 years without a single complaint, but suddenly my food was a medical hazard. Inch by inch, I became a ghost haunting my own home. I couldn't use the kitchen without permission. I couldn't watch TV because the volume bothered Dana. I couldn't have company over because the house was just too small for a crowd. My friends stopped coming by. My sisters stopped calling so much. Without even realizing it, I had been completely isolated, and Dana had orchestrated the whole thing with the precision of a maestro. But what shattered my heart was watching George change. The boy who used to hug me the second I walked through the door now barely gave me a nod. The son who used to ask about my day now acted like my stories from the hospital were a total bore. The son who used to defend me against the world now sat in dead silence, while his wife treated me like a pest. The straw that broke the camel's back came 3 months ago, when I finally scraped together the nerve to confront the situation. George had landed a solid job at a construction firm, and I figured they could finally move out. "George," I said one afternoon while Dana was at one of her doctor appointments, "now that you have steady work, have you guys thought about looking for your own place?" My son looked at me like I had just cursed at him. "Mom, Dana is pregnant again. We can't stress her out with a move right now." "But you've been here almost 10 years, I said softly. "This was always supposed to be a temporary setup." George sighed, and in that sigh, I heard Dana's exact voice. "Mom, frankly, we figured you liked having the company. At your age, living alone can be dangerous." At my age. Like 64 made me some fragile, crumbling old woman. Like the 10 years they had lived rent-free under my roof was some kind of favor they were doing for me. That night, lying in the cramped little guest room that had become my cell, I made a choice. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep being a stranger in my own home, treated like a burden by the very people I had taken in with open arms. The next day after George left for work and Dana went out with her friends, I did something I should have done years ago. I opened my safe and pulled out some documents I had carefully tucked away, hoping to God I'd never have to use them. But now I knew it was time. George needed to know the truth about the house he lived in, the truth about the keys he thought he had, the truth about what it actually means to own something. Because what neither George nor Dana knew was that the keys he carried in his pocket, the ones Dana had copied without my permission last year, did not open every lock in my house. And after what happened in that hospital room, it was time they learned exactly what that meant. George came over the next afternoon exactly as I asked. He came alone, just like I insisted, but I could tell by the look on his face he was furious. There was something different in the way he marched up to the front door, tense, defensive. Dana had probably filled his head with a million complaints about my irrational behavior at the hospital. "Mom," he said, walking in without even a proper hello, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday. Dana is extremely upset." "Dana is upset." I repeated the words, shutting the door behind him. "And how are you doing, George? How does a man feel when he watches his wife scream at his own mother like that?" He avoided my eyes, walking right into the living room like he owned the place. I followed him, watching him automatically sink into the armchair that used to be mine, the one Dana claimed as theirs years ago. "Mom, Dana just had a baby. The hormones, the stress." He started in with that tired, rehearsed voice he had perfected to justify his wife's actions. "Sit over there," I told him, pointing to the smaller chair. "I need you to listen to something." George gave me a weird look, but he did what he was told. I went back to my room, the tiny guest room I had been banished to, and grabbed a folder I had kept hidden for years. When I walked back out, George was staring at his phone, probably reading texts from Dana. "Put that away," I said with a sharpness that made him jump. "What you are about to hear is far more important than anything your wife has to say." I opened the folder and pulled out the very first document. It was a copy of a medical report dated 2 years ago. I handed it to him without a word. George took it, his brow furrowing. "What is this?" "Read it out loud," I told him. He looked down at the paper, and I saw the exact second his expression morphed from annoyance to pure confusion. "Patient Teresa Mitchell, 62 years old, psychiatric evaluation requested by..." George stopped dead, his eyes snapping up to meet mine. "Requested by what?" "Keep reading. A psychiatric evaluation requested by a concerned family member regarding possible cognitive decline. Patient presents alert-oriented with no signs of dementia or mental deterioration. Cognitive functions normal for her age. No psychiatric treatment or medication recommended." George dropped the paper like it had just caught fire. "Mom, what is this about?" I pulled another document from the folder. This one is from last year. It was another medical evaluation this time, requested by the son's spouse, citing deep concern for the mother-in-law's mental well-being. The results were identical. No mental issues, no signs of dementia. Completely normal mental capacity. "There are 5 more evaluations," I told him, pulling out the rest of the reports. "All of them requested by your wife over the last 3 years. Every single one with the exact same results." George went totally pale. "Dana requested these without my knowledge, using medical information she could have only gotten by digging through my personal files when I wasn't home." I pulled out another paper. But that is not the worst part. This document was different. It was a legal petition to obtain power of attorney over my finances, dated barely 6 months ago. Applicant Dana Patricia Mitchell. Relationship to subject, daughter-in-law. Reason for request: progressive mental decline preventing the subject from managing her own financial affairs. George's voice actually cracked as he read those last words. "Mom, I didn't know anything about this. You didn't know I snatched the paper back. You didn't know your wife was trying to have me declared legally incompetent. You didn't know she had been telling doctors, lawyers, and anyone else who would listen that I was losing my damn mind." George ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a little boy. "But Mom, she always says she's just worried about you. She says sometimes you forget things, that you leave the gas burners on." When I snapped, "When have I ever left a gas burner on?" He sat there in silence, racking his brain to remember a single time. "It never happened, George. But your wife needed to spin a narrative to justify her actions." I pulled more papers from the file. These are written testimonies she prepped for the court. Statements about incidents supposedly witnessed by the neighbors. George read them in dead silence, and I watched his face contort with every single line. The statements painted a picture of a confused old woman wandering down the street in her nightgown, leaving doors wide open, talking to thin air. None of those things had ever happened. "Mrs. Henderson didn't write this," George said, pointing a shaking finger at one of the statements. "She has severe arthritis. She can barely hold a pen." Exactly. Dana forged these statements. She traced signatures from package delivery receipts the neighbors had signed at our front door. George stood up abruptly and started pacing the floor. Why would she do something like this? I pulled out the final document, the most devastating one of all. "This is a property records investigation on this house," I said. "Requested by your wife 3 months ago." George took the paper, his hands trembling. It was a highly detailed report showing the property value, the paid-off mortgage, the legal status of the deed. Down at the bottom, there was a handwritten note. Estimated value, $250,000. No outstanding mortgages. Potential heirs, 1 son. "She looked up exactly what this house is worth," I whispered. "She knew down to the penny how much money she'd get if she managed to declare me incompetent and made you my legal guardian." George let the paper slip from his fingers and collapsed back into the chair. For the first time in years, I saw him truly look at his wife for the monster she was. "But there's more," I told him. "Something I found last week. I walked over to the landline on the wall and punched in the code to check the saved voicemails. I learned how to use that feature years ago when I first got the gut feeling Dana was intercepting my calls. George, you need to hear this. I hit play. Dana's voice filled the living room, crisp, clear, and unmistakable. Hello, this is Dana Mitchell. I'm calling on behalf of my mother-in-law, Teresa Mitchell. I need to schedule a consultation with a geriatric specialist. My mother-in-law is showing alarming signs of senile dementia, and we need a professional evaluation to determine if she is still fit to live on her own. I hit pause. George's jaw was practically on the floor. She made that call last month, I told him. There are 17 more saved in the system. I played the next one. Good morning. I'm Teresa Mitchell's daughter-in-law. I am deeply concerned about her mental state. Yesterday, we found her having a conversation with people who weren't even there. We need to start exploring assisted living options. Another one. My mother-in-law is living in a complete fantasy world. Yesterday, she accused us of stealing money that never even existed. Her behavior is becoming erratic and highly dangerous. With every single message, George sank deeper and deeper into the upholstery. I saw the exact moment the sheer scale of the betrayal finally broke him. Oh my God, he whispered. My God, Mom. I actually believed some of those things when she told me you said something confusing or forgot to turn the stove off. I believed her. Of course you believed her. She was your wife, and she is incredibly convincing. I sat down across from him, feeling a strange cocktail of deep sorrow and massive relief that he was finally opening his eyes. But George, didn't you ever stop to wonder why these little incidents only ever happened when you weren't home? He shook his head, tears finally spilling over his lashes. How could I be so blind? Because she knew exactly how to play you. She drip-fed you doubts about my mental state so slowly you never even saw the poison. I leaned in closer. George, your wife has been plotting for years to have me declared incompetent so she could steal my house. But why at the hospital? Why humiliate me like that in front of the nurses? I pulled the last piece of paper from the file. It was a medical appointment booked for the following week. Because she needed a public spectacle, a professional witness who could testify they saw my irrational behavior around my own flesh and blood. I tapped the date on the paper. Look at this. She already booked an emergency appointment with a geriatric psychiatrist for tomorrow. She was going to use my reaction at the hospital as concrete proof that my mental condition was rapidly deteriorating. George buried his face in his hands. What kind of person does something like this? The kind of person who marries a man for his real estate, not for love, I replied with a terrifying calm. The kind of person who can spend 10 years faking affection while actively plotting to steal everything you've ever worked for. We sat there in silence for a long time. George cried quietly, and I felt this bizarre, overwhelming sense of peace. After years of doubting my own sanity, of wondering if my mind was actually slipping away, I finally had the answers. Mom, George finally said, looking up at me through bloodshot eyes. What are we going to do? I smiled for the first time in months. A real smile, not the plastic one I wore to keep the peace. We are going to give her exactly what she deserves, I told him. But first, you need to know about the keys. What about the keys? George asked, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I stood up and walked over to the window overlooking the backyard. For years, I had stood right here and watched Dana take over every square inch of my property. Watched her turn my garden into her personal lounge. Watched her install a brand new grill without even asking me. George, when was the last time you actually used a key to unlock the front door? He frowned. I don't know. It's been a while. Dana is always home, so... Exactly. Dana is always home. In my house, controlling exactly who comes in and who goes out. I turned back to face him. Did you ever ask yourself how she got those keys? Well, you gave them to her when we moved in. No, I said cold and hard. I never gave Dana a key to this house. George fell silent, processing the weight of that sentence. The keys she carries around, the ones in your pocket right now. She went out and had those copied herself the second year you lived here. Remember she told you she lost hers and needed an emergency spare? Yeah, I remember that. Those keys unlock the front door and the back door. But there are 3 more locks in this house you two don't even know exist. I walked back to my tiny room and pulled a different set of keys from my nightstand drawer. These are the real keys. George stood up and followed me as I walked over to a perfectly normal-looking wall right next to the fireplace. I pressed on a hidden panel and a small metal door popped open. "What is that?" George asked, his eyes wide as saucers. "A wall safe. I had it put in 15 years ago after my locker got robbed at the hospital." I unlocked the safe with one of the special keys. This is where I keep all the things that matter. The deed to the house, my will, my emergency cash. I pulled out a thick binder and held it up. "Do you have any idea how much money I have saved up, George?" He shook his head. $110,000 in CDs, government bonds, and a high-yield savings account Dana doesn't even know exists. I watched his jaw drop. 40 years of grinding through night shifts, living way below my means, hoarding every single dime I could scrape together. "Mom, I had no idea you had that kind of money." "Of course you didn't, because I don't trust your wife enough to talk about finances when she's in the room." I locked the safe back up and clicked the panel into place, but she smelled the money. She suspected I had a nest egg. That's why she needed to control me. That's why she had to declare me incompetent. We walked into the kitchen where I slid a different key off the ring. "This key opens the basement," I said, pointing to a door that looked exactly like a broom closet. "Did you even know this house had a basement?" George looked at me like I had 2 heads. "Mom, that's the utility closet." I slid the special key into the lock and turned it. Instead of the mops and buckets George expected, a set of wooden stairs led down into the dark. "Come with me," I said. The basement wasn't huge, but it was spotless. Boxes stacked and labeled with Christmas ornaments. Old photo albums from when George was a baby. Some antique furniture covered in sheets. But in the far back corner sat something that stopped George dead in his tracks. A heavy desk with a desktop computer, a printer, and stacks of manila folders jammed into filing cabinets. "What is all this?" he asked. "My private office, where I have spent the last 3 years documenting every single move your wife makes." I sat down in the rolling chair in front of the monitor. Every lie she told about me on the phone, every document she forged, every step of her sick plan to steal my life. I woke up the computer and opened a folder packed with audio files. "You remember that intercom system I had installed 5 years ago? The one I told you was just so I could hear the doorbell when I was out back in the garden." George nodded. "The truth is, I wired this entire house for sound. I have recordings of every conversation Dana has had with her friends, with her lawyers. With you, I clicked an audio file. Listen to this." Dana's voice hissed through the computer speakers, crystal clear. "No, I'm not being cruel, but you have to understand the old bat has to go. George is way too soft to do what needs to be done." It was a phone call with someone who sounded exactly like a lawyer. "The plan is simple," Dana's voice continued. "I get her declared incompetent. I get George appointed as her legal guardian, and then we ship her off to a home. Once she's out of the house, we can sell the place and pocket the cash." George collapsed into a folding chair next to the desk. "Oh my God." "There's more," I said, double-clicking another file. "This one is from 2 weeks ago. This time Dana was chatting with a friend. The hardest part is going to be convincing George his mother is completely losing her mind. But I've been planting the seeds for years. Every time she does something perfectly normal, I tell him it was weird. Every time she complains about something totally valid, I tell him she's getting paranoid." "How long have you been recording her?" George asked, his voice barely a rasp. "Ever since I caught her digging through my medical records. Ever since I realized she made copies of my house keys behind my back. Ever since I finally realized I wasn't being paranoid, she was actually hunting me." I tossed a thick folder of printed photographs onto the desk. "I put in cameras too. Here is your wife going through my desk when she thought I was pulling a double shift. Here she is writing down the numbers off my credit cards. Here she is on the phone with the lawyer, figuring out how to fast-track the incompetency hearing." George picked up the photos, his hands shaking violently. One of them clearly showed Dana sitting at my desk, my bank statements spread out like a fan, scribbling information into a little notebook. "But that's not even the kicker," I continued. "This is the one that really broke my heart." I opened a video file. It was footage of Dana talking to an older woman. I recognized as the mother of one of her friends. "Mrs. Miller, I really need a favor," Dana was saying on the screen. "My mother-in-law is very, very sick, mentally, but she refuses to accept it. Would you be willing to call social services and report that you've seen some deeply concerning behavior? Your testimony could really help us get her the help she desperately needs." "What kind of behavior?" Mrs. Miller asked. "Well, I've caught her talking to herself out in the garden. Sometimes she wanders around in her nightgown. Just yesterday, I saw her trying to unlock the neighbor's front door because she thought it was hers." George buried his face in his hands again. "None of that is true. Of course it's not true. But Mrs. Miller doesn't know me well enough to know the difference. And Dana knew exactly what she was doing when she picked her as a witness." I slid a printed list of names and phone numbers across the desk. "This is a list of every single person Dana contacted to fabricate testimonies about my mental state. 12 people total. Some of them don't even know me." George read the list in dead silence. He recognized the names: neighbors from down the block, mothers of Dana's friends, even a cashier from the grocery store up the street. "George," I said softly, "your wife didn't just plan on stealing my house and my life savings. She planned on destroying my reputation in this entire neighborhood. She wanted to make sure everyone thought I was crazy, so that when I finally screamed for help, not a single soul would believe me." He looked up at me, and the devastation in his eyes told me he finally grasped the sheer magnitude of the evil she had brought into our home. "What do we do?" he asked. "We are going to use her own playbook against her," I told him. "But first, I need to show you the third key." We walked back upstairs to the main floor, and I headed straight for what looked like a normal coat closet by the front door. I used the third special key to unlock a hidden deadbolt. Inside was a sleek electronic control panel wired into the very bones of the house. A fully integrated security system, I explained. Cameras, mics, and silent alarms hardwired straight to the police precinct. I've been putting it in piece by piece over the last 2 years. The police know all about this. Detective Sarah Reynolds has been my point of contact. I've been feeding her copies of every piece of evidence I collect. I pointed to a glowing red button on the panel. "If I hit this button right here, she and her team will kick that door down in less than 5 minutes." George stood there in absolute silence for a long time, soaking in everything he had just seen and heard. "Mom," he finally choked out, "I am so sorry. I didn't see what was happening." "You weren't supposed to see it," I answered. "She played you just as masterfully as she played me. The only difference is I got suspicious and you trusted the woman you married." "Can I still fix this? Is there any way on God's green earth I can ever earn your trust back?" I smiled and put a hand on his shoulder. "George, the fact that you are standing right here, listening to the truth and actually believing me, is a massive step. What do you need me to do? Tomorrow your wife is bringing my grandson home. She expects me to play the role of the beaten-down, submissive old woman I've been playing for 10 years. I walked over to the window and stared out at the street. But tomorrow she is in for a very rude awakening." "What kind of awakening?" I turned back to him, flashing a smile I hadn't felt in my bones for a decade. "She's going to find out that the crazy old lady she thought she could manipulate holds all the real keys to this house. And it is high time she learns what it means to live with the consequences of her own actions." Dana pulled into the driveway the next afternoon, lugging the baby in his car seat and a heavy hospital bag. I watched her from the window of my tiny room. As George walked out to help her, I noticed a shift in the way he carried himself. Tighter, hyper-aware. He was no longer the blind fool from 2 days ago. Teresa Dana called out from the front door, using that sickly sweet fake voice she had polished to a shine over the years. "Come meet your grandson." I took my sweet time walking down the stairs. For 10 years, I had come running the second she called my name, always desperate to please, to keep the peace. Those days were dead and buried. When I stepped into the living room, Dana was perched in my old favorite armchair, holding the baby like a royal jewel. George stood stiffly by the window, avoiding my eyes, clearly wrestling with the nightmare he had woken up to. "Look how gorgeous he is," Dana cooed, holding the boy up so I could get a look. Her voice had that theatrical pitch she always used when she wanted to play house in front of George. "I think he's ready to meet his grandma." I walked over slowly, keeping my hands glued to my sides. "He is beautiful," I said, my voice dead calm. What's his name? Michael Alexander, George answered from the window. After my grandfather. Dana held the baby out to me, but I didn't lift a finger to take him. You're not going to hold him? She asked, flashing a smile that didn't even come close to reaching her eyes. Well, I said, keeping my tone light and breezy. Yesterday you told me I was filthy. I wouldn't want to contaminate him. The silence that hit the room was deafening. George turned away from the window, his shoulders wound tight as piano wire. Dana blinked rapidly, clearly blindsided that I would throw her own vicious words right back in her face. Oh, Teresa, she forced a nervous little laugh. I was just so exhausted after the delivery. You know how those postpartum hormones are. I didn't mean it. You didn't? I asked, tilting my head. Because it sounded pretty damn sincere at the time. Dana shot a look at George, waiting for him to swoop in and shut me down like he always did. But George just stood there, like a statue, watching the show with an expression I couldn't quite read. Well, of course you can hold him, Dana said, stretching her plastic smile even wider. You're his grandmother. Just, maybe after you go wash your hands. Newborns are just so fragile. Of course, I said. After all, we wouldn't want him catching anything from the crazy old lady who lives in the house. Dana went completely rigid. Teresa, I have never called you crazy. Have you? I walked over to the hidden panel by the fireplace, popped it open, and pulled out a sleek digital voice recorder. That is fascinating, because I have hours of audio right here where you say those exact words. The color drained out of Dana's face like water down a drain. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. I hit play. Her own voice echoed off the living room walls. The old bat is completely losing her mind, Mom. Yesterday, I caught her talking to herself out in the garden. I really think it's time George seriously considers putting her in a home. Dana shot up from the chair so fast she nearly dropped the baby. Where did you get that? Oh, I have plenty more, I said, pulling a stack of flash drives out of the wall safe. Do you want to hear the tape where you tell your lawyer exactly how you plan to declare me incompetent? Or would you rather listen to the call where you beg Mrs. Miller to lie to social services about my behavior? George stepped forward and gently took the baby from Dana's arms. She was shaking like a leaf. Teresa, that's wiretapping, Dana stammered. You can't record people without their consent. Actually, I can, I replied, my voice smooth as glass. This is my house. I installed a state-of-the-art security system. Every room you've walked into, every phone call you've made under this roof for the last 3 years is fully documented. I walked over to the corner desk and grabbed a massive binder. I have photographs too, I kept going. Remember when you thought I was working a double shift so you decided to dig through my private medical files? Or the afternoon you sat at my desk, copying down my credit card numbers? Dana backed up against the wall like a cornered rat. George, she pleaded, her voice cracking as she turned to her husband. You have to stop this. Your mother is having a full-blown psychotic break. George looked at her with a face I had never seen him wear. A cold, hard mix of absolute disgust and deep pity. No, Dana, he said, his voice like iron. My mother is perfectly sane. You are the one who has been lying through your teeth for years. Dana opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had finally lost control of the chessboard she had been rigging for a decade. But wait, there's more, I said. George, could you grab the laptop from the basement? The basement? Dana frowned, her voice trembling. What basement? George vanished for a minute and walked back in carrying the laptop. I opened it up and clicked straight to a specific folder. These are all the fraudulent medical requests you submitted, I said, turning the screen so she could see. 5 psychiatric evaluations you requested behind my back. Every single one of them designed to fabricate a medical paper trail, proving I was mentally unfit to handle my own life. Dana collapsed back into the chair, her tough girl act totally shattered. I also have copies of your petition for power of attorney, I went on, and the property records where you looked up exactly what my house is worth. $250,000 right paid in full. Pretty tempting for someone who's been living rent-free for 10 years. Teresa, please. Dana started to cry, but the tears looked just as calculated as every other move she'd made. I was just worried about your well-being. My well-being. I stepped right up to her, feeling a cold, controlled fury I had kept bottled up for years. Were you worried about my well-being when you told Dr. Martin I was hallucinating people in the living room? Were you worried about my well-being when you told Mrs. Henderson I was wandering the streets in my nightgown? George stepped closer, holding his son tight. Dana, is all of this true? She looked up at him with big, pleading eyes. George, baby, you have to understand. Your mother is getting older, and I just thought that someday we might need to… Need to what? George cut her off like a knife. Need to steal her house? Need to lock her up in a ward against her will? Need to destroy her name in front of the whole neighborhood? Dana buried her face in her hands. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. No. I pulled the final document from the binder. Because according to this step-by-step master plan you wrote out in your own diary, this is exactly how it was supposed to happen. I tossed pages and pages of her own handwriting onto her lap. A highly detailed, bullet-pointed strategy to declare me insane and take my property. Phase 1. Plant seeds of doubt about mental state. Phase 2. Document erratic behavior with witnesses. Phase 3. Obtain psychiatric evaluations supporting mental incompetence. Phase 4. Secure power of attorney through George. Phase 5. Commit to geriatric facility. Phase 6. Sell property. George read the pages over my shoulder, his breathing getting heavier with every line. There's more, I told him. Once the old bat is out of the picture, George and I can finally start our real life. The cash from the house will be enough to buy us something much nicer in a better zip code. George will never even have to know how badly he got played. George let out a sound that was half groan, half scream. How could you, he asked her. How could you plan something so sick? Dana stood up suddenly, finding a scrap of her old arrogance. Because someone had to be practical. George, your mother isn't going to live forever. And when she dies, where does that leave us? Living in a house that technically belongs to her with zero legal rights? So you married me for the real estate, George said, his voice barely a whisper. Dana realized her mistake a second too late. No, George, that is not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant, I cut in. And I have the phone tapes to prove it. Conversations with your sister, where you flat out admit you married George because you knew he was sitting on a gold mine of an inheritance. George looked at me, his eyes hollowed out with grief. She actually said that. I nodded, my heart breaking for him, among many other things. Dana made a move for the front door, but George blocked her path. No, he said, his voice dead and cold. You are not leaving until you hear every last word my mother has to say. There is really only one thing left, I said, walking over to the phone. Detective Reynolds, it's Teresa Mitchell. It's time. Detective Reynolds pulled up in less than 10 minutes, flanked by a uniformed officer. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a calm, heavy presence that instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Mrs. Mitchell, she said, giving me a firm handshake. Are you ready to proceed? Absolutely, I replied. Dana was curled up on the sofa, wrapping her arms around herself like she was freezing. George stood rigid by the window, clutching the baby to his chest, his face a war zone of conflicting emotions. Dana, Patricia Mitchell, the detective, started pulling a notepad from her pocket. We have been investigating multiple reports of document fraud, medical identity theft, and attempted fraudulent acquisition of power of attorney. This is completely ridiculous, Dana muttered, but the old venom was entirely gone. Detective Reynolds popped open a thick manila folder. We have audio surveillance, photographic evidence, forged legal documents, and sworn statements from multiple sources confirming a systematic pattern of elder abuse against a vulnerable individual. Elder abuse. George spun around. Detective, what does this actually mean, Mr. Mitchell? The charges we are looking at include elder abuse, document fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Depending on how the DA wants to play this, we are looking at anywhere from 5 to 15 years in state prison. The baby started crying like he could feel the absolute terror radiating through the room. George rocked him automatically, but his eyes stayed locked on his wife. However, the detective continued turning to look right at me. Mrs. Mitchell has indicated that she might be willing to consider an alternative resolution. Every eye in the room snapped to me. For weeks, I had dreamed about this exact moment, fantasized about watching Dana get dragged out of my house in handcuffs, facing the full, brutal weight of the law. But standing there, watching my son hold his newborn boy, I knew there was a cleaner way out. "Dana," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You have a choice." She looked up at me, a pathetic mix of hope and absolute terror written across her face. "You can face the criminal charges, which means years behind bars and a permanent felony record that will follow you to the grave. Or you can accept my terms for a private resolution." "What terms?" she asked, her voice cracking. I sat down directly across from her, feeling the crushing weight of 10 years of humiliation finally shifting into something beautiful. Total, absolute power over my own life. "First, you are moving out of my house, today. You have until 6 o'clock tonight to pack your personal belongings." Dana nodded frantically. "Second, you are signing a legally binding document waiving any and all future claims to this property, or any piece of my estate." "Okay." "Third, you will pay full restitution for the legal and medical expenses you caused me." My lawyer calculated the total at $8,500. George stepped forward. "Mom, we don't have that kind of money." "Dana has it," I replied without blinking. "Sitting right in the secret high-yield savings account she opened using my stolen financial data. Isn't that right, Dana?" She went completely white, but she nodded. "Fourth, you will have zero contact with me for the rest of my natural life. No phone calls, no text messages, no drop-ins. You vanish from my existence completely." "And George?" she asked, her voice shaking. "And my son?" I looked at my boy, who was holding on to his baby like it was the only real thing left in a world that had just been burned to the ground. "George is a grown man," I said. "He can make his own choices about his marriage and his family. But if you ever try to use my grandson as leverage to manipulate or emotionally blackmail me, I will reactivate the criminal charges before you can even blink." Detective Reynolds pulled a stack of legal papers from her folder. "If you agree to these terms, Mrs. Mitchell, we need your signature on these documents right now." Dana took the papers with trembling hands. As she read through the clauses, I watched the exact second the reality hit her. She hadn't just lost the house and the money she was drooling over. She had lost every single ounce of power she ever held over me. "And if I don't sign?" she asked weakly. "Then I will see you in court," the detective replied. "And I guarantee you, with the mountain of evidence we have, you will not be walking out the front door." Dana signed every single page without another word. George walked over to me as the detective packed up the paperwork. "Mom," he said, his voice shattering, "I don't even know how to begin to ask for your forgiveness, for letting this happen." "George, you were a victim of her manipulation too," I answered gently, touching his arm. "But right now, you have a massive choice to make." He looked at me, his eyes brimming with tears. "What do you mean? Are you going to stay married to a woman who plotted to destroy your mother for a payout? Or are you going to decide what kind of father you want to be for that little boy?" George looked at Dana, who was already packing her bags like a mindless drone. Then he looked down at the baby in his arms. "I don't think I can ever forgive her for this," he admitted. "You don't have to figure it out today," I told him, "but you do need to figure out where you are going to sleep tonight, because she does not live here anymore." George nodded slowly. Can I stay here just until I get things sorted out?" I smiled. A real, genuine smile for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "This has always been your home, son. Now I just need you to respect that it is mine, too." 3 hours later, Dana had packed her life into the trunk of her car and was gone. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no tearful last-minute pleas. She just grabbed her bags, walked out the front door, got behind the wheel, and vanished from our lives forever. George and I sat in the living room with the baby, wrapped in a silence I hadn't felt in a decade. But this time it wasn't a heavy, suffocating silence. It was pure peace. "How do you feel?" George asked. I looked around my living room, seeing my furniture exactly where I had placed it years ago, seeing the photos I had framed, seeing the space that truly, finally belonged to me. Free, I answered simply. George handed the baby over, and for the very first time, I held my grandson in my arms. He was tiny and warm, and he had George's exact eyes. "Hello, Michael," I whispered. "I'm your Grandma Teresa, and I promise you, you will always have a place in this house." The baby stared up at me with those big, serious newborn eyes, almost like he understood the gravity of the moment. George sat down next to me on the sofa. "Mom, there is something I have to ask you." "Go ahead." "Do you really have $110,000 saved up?" I laughed, a deep belly laugh I hadn't let out in years. "George, I have a hell of a lot more than that, but that stays strictly between you and me." He smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen on his face in months. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. I looked out the window, out toward the garden, the patio, the world that was finally mine again. "I am going to live," I said. "I am going to be the grandmother I always wanted to be. I am going to cook in my own kitchen without asking for permission. I am going to have my friends over without hiding. I am going to sleep in my own damn bed." I stood up, cradling the baby, and walked out the back door into the garden. George followed right behind me. "And I am going to plant some new flowers," I kept going. "Whatever kind I want, exactly where I want them. And I am going to teach this little boy how to work the dirt, just like I taught his dad a long time ago." George wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me for being so blind?" he asked. "I already have," I answered, watching the late afternoon sun hit the flower beds I would soon bring back to life. "But more importantly, you need to forgive yourself and decide exactly what kind of man you are going to be from this day forward." We stood there together, 3 generations of the Mitchell family, standing in the garden of the house that had always been our home. And for the first time in 10 years, it actually felt like it. That night, after George put the baby down in his old childhood bedroom, I walked upstairs to the master suite, my room. I threw open the heavy curtains Dana always kept drawn shut and let the moonlight flood the floorboards. I sat down at my vanity, the exact same one where my mother used to brush my hair when I was a little girl, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the broken, terrified old lady from a week ago. She was Teresa Mitchell, 64 years old, the undisputed owner of her own home, the grandmother to a beautiful baby boy, and completely, absolutely free. Completely free. I had finally learned that sometimes revenge isn't about destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes the sweetest revenge of all is simply taking your life back and living it entirely on your own terms. And that, at long last, was exactly what I was going to do. Yeah.